My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm teaching in the Courage to Be program this year, and also run the Hannah Arendt Center, which sponsors these programs. This is the second talk of the year. Usually we have 3. We may have to, depending on what happens, cancel the last one. We'll see. We'll keep you posted. But I want to thank you all for being here tonight. To have the courage to come out in the time of coronavirus. It is a strange time, and you know, we live in a world in which there's a lot pushing us to stay out of public life, to stay off the streets, to be compliant. You know, those of you who've been reading Hannah Arendt this semester know that for her, public life, being in political life, the first virtue of political life is courage, to risk your reputation in life by entering the public world. And there's nothing so much like a contagion or a pandemic to make people retreat to their private houses and quarantine. So this will be a time over the next few months where it will be easy to just stay home and be quiet. And we're entering the main political season of the year, so this will be a challenge for us all how to mobilize that. But these were things I hope we will continue to talk about in the Courage to Be seminars going on, and you should keep them in mind. And certainly in my seminar, which is on the Hong Kong protests, one of the main questions is to what extent the Hong Kong protests are being destroyed or ended by the coronavirus. As the election season ramps up in the United States, I think there's no doubt a question of how the coronavirus will affect the conventions over the summer, let alone campaigning and even voting. I know this is one of the big issues people are talking about right now is how will people vote? Will they be able to vote? So thank you for being here. My job today is to introduce one of our Courage to Be fellows who helped select and invite and bring the speaker tonight. Her name is Charlotte Geisler. She's a global and international studies major, a junior, interested in global politics, economics, and social justice reform. So Charlotte, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming and joining us for dinner tonight. I'm excited to introduce to you Laurie Jo Reynolds. Laurie Jo is an assistant professor in the Department of Art at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She is most well known for her efforts to challenge traditional criminal justice systems in the United States. Specifically, Laurie Jo has battled the establishments of solitary confinement and public conviction registries. For 8 years, Laurie Jo organized a campaign to close the TAMS solitary confinement correctional facility. She collaborated with many families, artists, and politicians connected to prisoners in TAMS, and due to her efforts, the facility closed in 2013. Laurie Jo utilizes legislative art, a term she coined herself, to incite concrete political change. In the summer of 2018, I had the pleasure of working together with Laurie Jo to deregister Illinois. She practices courage in her work every day as she fights against tough opposition to bring justice to the underrepresented. Please help me introduce and welcome Laurie Jo.
I can't even hug Charlotte because we're so afraid of the coronavirus. Let's see. I don't know where my speech is actually. Is it over here?
Oh, I think it might be here.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for having me. Thank you to the Courage to Be fellows. and the faculty and staff at the Hannah Arendt Center. And thank you so much to Charlotte. I hope everyone can see this screen. Can you all see the screen? Try to see the screen if you can. Okay, so there's some discussion of violence ahead, violence by individuals and by the state. But I'm just going to get started. You can run out if you need to. A supermax is a prison dedicated to solitary confinement. Most were built in the 1980s and 90s with the general stated purpose of breaking people down. People called the worst of the worst. Tam's Supermax prison opened in 1998 at the tip of southern Illinois. It was designed for sensory deprivation, permanent solitary confinement, no communal activity, no communal spaces, no phone calls, no contact visits. In this prison, men never leave the cell, except to exercise alone in a concrete pen or in a cage if they're considered mentally ill. Food is pushed through a slot in the cell door for every meal. Interaction and sensory stimulation are physiological needs. Without them, our brains go into crisis. When people break down in solitary, it's not because they're weak, it's because they're human. Indeed, because animals are relational creatures. In 2006, a group of artists started the TAMS Poetry Committee to provide the men with some social contact. We sent poems, they sent poems. Bruce wrote back, "Hi committee, is this for real? I can't believe someone cares enough to send a pick-me-up to the worst of the worst." The men wrote about their hallucinations, psychosis, self-mutilation, and suicide attempts, all expected consequences of solitary confinement. One man finally wrote, "Hey, this poetry is great, but could you please tell the governor what they're doing to us down here?" In 2008, we launched TAMS Year 10, a legislative campaign to reform or close the Supermax at the 10-year anniversary of its opening. Men were originally supposed to be there for 1 year, but at this point, 1/3 of them had been there the entire decade. Prison reform was not an option 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But getting politicians to stand up for men labeled the worst of the worst was considered hopeless. But the men in TAMS felt there was nothing to lose. The TAMS Year 10 campaign, as Charlotte said, was developed by formerly and currently incarcerated men, family members, advocates, attorneys, artists, and we had 3 organizing principles. 1, recognize that we're all bystanders to torture, but we don't have to be. 2, every event has a goal. Not permitted, just putting information out into the ether. And 3, let the men from TAMS speak for themselves. They can undo the myth of the worst of the worst. When Pat Quinn became governor in 2009, we targeted him on this issue, and we worked with excellent state reps. So I'm going to summarize this long campaign. That's a state senator. We held powerful, well-attended hearings, introduced legislation, worked with reporters who wrote exposés, we pulled in international human rights monitors, negotiated with the Department of Corrections, organized lobby days and tactical media campaigns, and projects designed to shift the perception of the men in TAMS. So one project was called Photo Request from Solitary. We invited men in isolation to request a photograph of anything at all, real or imagined, such as my auntie's house at 63rd and Marshfield, facing west at 2 p.m. 2 children at the piano with a rose. J-Lo's butt in a video with Ben Affleck. Some people wanted photographs of themselves, which we got from the IDOC website. So Roberto wanted a picture of himself to send his family. Just his photo from the website with a plain blue sky background. Ike wanted a photo within a photo of him in the lakefront, him in Navy Pier, him in wild lions, him in wild wolves. 5 copies of each. So this is Ike and wild lions. Robert wanted my mom in front of a mansion with a Hummer and money on the ground. When we first got these requests back, I was so struck by the descriptions themselves that I felt that even making the photos would just be disappointing and redundant. And they weren't, but that brought up this concept, anamnesis, which is the concept in Plato's dialogues that resolves the paradox of knowledge, which is that if you don't know the attributes or properties of something, you won't recognize it even if you see it. And the converse is true. If you do already know, then you shouldn't need to seek it at all. So this showed us that rather than us giving them images, the prisoners were giving us images. This is Willie Sterling's impossible to read request for a colossal cross in southern Illinois called Bald Knob Cross. But it isn't just the cross he wanted us holding a prayer vigil at the cross, praying for his deliverance from TAMS and to be granted parole. So that's us. So this project is now a collaboration with Solitary Watch, which is co-led by me, the artist Janine Olson, and Jean Casella. And Oprah Magazine just like 5 days ago did a feature on it and took some of the photos themselves. And you too can make an image for somebody in solitary by going to the website photorequestfromsolitary.org and seeing what requests are available and uploading one. So back to this story. In 2009, we cracked the nut. Our governor appointed a new corrections chief to review the supermax as his first task. And he said about TAMS, and was the first governor to say so, "It's an issue I take seriously." In reaction, the Chicago Tribune editorial board wrote a shoddy, factually incorrect, and asinine editorial about TAMS. So to express our discontent, we picketed and delivered 10 corrections to the editorial, to the board, on stone tablets. And security stopped us at the door. But we did get a meeting with the editorial board. There's Johnny, and there's the editorial board. A few months later, the new IDOC director announced a 10-point plan for reform. And skipping ahead, in 2012, our governor proposed the outright closure of TAMS. However, the powerful guards union staged a fear-mongering campaign to keep it open for the jobs that they weren't actually losing. A prison designed for sensory deprivation that drove men to self-mutilation and suicide, they said, saves lives. This union was AFSCME, who MLK marched with in Memphis in 1968, with the message that human rights and workers' rights are inseparable. And in response, the mothers lobbied in Springfield. These are their special lobbying cards. And they marched to AFSCME headquarters and said, "My son is not a paycheck, and torture is a crime, not a career." In 2013, after a long, painful test of political will, Governor Quinn shut the Supermax down. We sent them in this card to their new prisons, which was drawn by Isaiah, whose dad was in TAMS. And as you can see, TAMS is being destroyed by a wrecking ball with aliens overhead. The men wrote to describe their journey back into the world of sensation. David wrote, "Our natural human senses, having been so repressed at TAMS, were suddenly and shockingly activated simply by boarding the IDOC bus." And Juan said, "I can actually shake my neighbor's hand. It was surreal." After TAMS closed, we advocated for the men at their new prisons and proudly supported Governor Quinn's re-election. And he lost, and that was in part because he had closed TAMS. The Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben uses the term homo sacer, adopted from ancient Roman law, to describe in modern times groups or individuals given the status of non-person. His work is helpful to conceptualize how the punitive turn in the criminal justice system of the 80s and 90s created classes of non-persons. Homo sacer are unprotected by the state. In fact, the state calls for their ostracism, exile, or civil death. He also writes about how states of exception, which is the legal suspension of the law in response to exceptional threats to the state, has become an extraordinary technique of governing. That's how solitary confinement, all but vanished from American correctional history for 100 years because it was so damaging, re-emerged in the Tough on Crime 90s. The worst of the worst was the correctional taxonomy used to justify the supermax regime. This phrase was ubiquitous and practically treated as a scientific diagnosis. Those are the worst of the worst. But our criminal justice system is premised on self-fulfilling categories like these and on the public never bothering to think twice about them. We shouldn't support laws and policies we know nothing about, or use the labels provided by the prison system or the state, or treat people and their families as if they are disposable because they have those labels. These are pictures off the IDOC website where they just thought it was totally fine to show this as a prisoner at TAMS. And I used to search the website to look at these pictures to see how the prisoners were doing. But we can collectively value people's lives. We can rewrite those labels. Back in the 90s, we made new, often racialized categories of people to justify treatment that would otherwise defy common sense and human rights. We did this through media sensationalism and political grandstanding. Poor black and brown women with cocaine charges, we shamed and incarcerated out of concern for their children, who we labeled crack babies, who we orphaned. We now know babies should be with their parents. We already reviewed the worst of the worst, the label that has justified keeping prisoners in sensory deprivation for years and decades without human contact. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture disagrees with this, disagreed, the last one did, so does the current one, and so did Obama. But we haven't undone these policies, far from it. You all probably know about super predators, black youth, now middle-aged prisoners, trying one at a time for new hearings, since the Supreme Court found their mandatory life sentences cruel and unusual. Who used that term, super predator? Hillary. Joe Biden probably said it also, I think. Everyone did. Demonization was the political logic of the 90s. Hillary had to atone for calling people super predators, but so should everyone. But it's easier to get outraged at the categories of the recent past than to take responsibility for the ones in the present that are still so appealing. What labels do we use now that are as degrading as the term super predators? Maybe the people we currently call predators. When people see these terms, they think they have scientific validity, but politicians came up with them. There's no criminal history consulted, no evaluation, no risk assessment, not even a definition of predator or predatory. But nearly anyone with any sex offense conviction in Illinois has this label for life. The police do publish a disclaimer. It says, legislators wanted this, we make no assumptions about these people and don't harass them. These classifications produce confusion about why crimes are committed and to whom, and therefore fail to address the tremendous harm that comes from violence. They mask the structural processes that drive crime or criminalization and lead to intellectual and political confusion, just as racial classification systems do. Hyper-incarceration followed decades of concentrated economic and political divestment. That's why neighborhoods with high incarceration rates also have high poverty and crime rates. Crime victims fill our prisons. But prisons not only don't address anything that led to incarceration or meet people's needs, they degrade people, separate families, and worsen life outcomes. True violence prevention means supporting the whole health of a community: jobs, housing, healthcare, mental health, behavioral health, childcare, preschool, sex ed, relationship ed, victim services, senior support, disability support, reentry, etc. But instead, for the past 20 years, we've tried to explain and address crime by creating categories of people who commit crimes, and then saying that's the reason we have crimes. In Illinois, we have a murder registry, violent crimes registry, gun registry, meth manufacturing, an arson registry that isn't even functioning, and of course a sex offense registry. And I probably forgot one. But I can't tell you one thing we're doing to address entrenched inequality and unemployment, or to address the trauma and desensitization that comes from poverty, deprivation, exposure to violence, or the impact of communities becoming siloed away from economic prosperity and access to public goods. Goods that everyone deserves, but only some of us have. Some 47% of people in Illinois have arrest or conviction records, and we have strikingly high rates of people on public conviction registries. 1 in every 147 men in Illinois is on a registry, and 1 in every 42 black men. But we know that gun violence, gang violence, substance abuse, child abuse and neglect, sexual violence, domestic violence will not be prevented by listing people with past convictions on the internet. That's why advocates for crime survivors and advocates for formerly incarcerated people are working together to challenge public conviction registries. We know the life-shattering impact of violence and incarceration. And we see how registry and banishment laws lead to homelessness and weaken the resilience of families and waste public safety resources that should be spent preventing victimization, supporting survivors, and restoring people responsible for harm. And thank you to my partners at the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation for building this partnership and for deeply caring about what these laws are doing to real people. Registry and banishment laws do not make our community safe. They do not prevent crime. The vast majority of people who harm others will not be on any sex offense registry, and those who are unlikely to commit another offense. Reoffense rates are extremely low for people who have been punished. This well-known New York study examined differences in arrest rates before and after registry laws and showed they had no impact. They also found that 95% of arrests for sex offenses are of people not on a registry. Only 5% are from people on the registry. And that's reported. Unreported abuse is far more likely to be from people not on registries. How many more examples in this world do we need to grasp that? In our system, sexual misconduct happens a lot and reporting rates are very low. Our system has so little to offer survivors that many would rather handle it on their own or do absolutely nothing than report. People would report if they thought it was in their best interest. Me Too amplifies what we already know and have known. Sexual harm is committed by ordinary people, and it happens a lot. And instead, we target and scapegoat the very people who have been held accountable and should be allowed to move on with their lives. Our hundreds of restrictions are counter to best practices. These laws push people and their families into poverty, unemployment, housing insecurity, homelessness, and social isolation. It's just totally disconnected from public safety. In fact, legislators piled on registry and banishment laws for a particular reason, so they could run direct mail flyers that said they were tough on sexual predators. And then when they do that, they and everyone has to vote for them or risk an attack ad. This is a true crisis of lawmaking. Registries have been used to exploit sexual violence for re-election campaigns, not prevent it. We've now passed 20 years of laws and restrictions, all in piecemeal fashion, one bill at a time. So states each have their own convoluted, confusing maze of contradictory and incoherent policies. In Illinois, this includes, and most states this includes, well, in every state it includes, public conviction registries and public notification. So this is giving police personal data for public websites with strict reporting requirements, like you have to report changes in work, housing, school, car within 72 hours, or even if you leave your house within 72 hours, for life, along with URLs and just all kinds of other information. And if you don't report, it's a felony. In Georgia, that particular felony is 30 years to not report a piece of data to the police for the rest of your life. Public space banishment is another category of laws. So it's a felony offense to come in Chicago within a city block of regularly placed public assets like parks, schools, bike trails, sports fields. It's a lot of land you can't walk on. And in fact, the entire Chicago lakefront and museum campus are prohibited for life. Housing banishment laws are the same concept, but they prohibit where you can live. So this shows a place in Champaign-Urbana that's how housing banishment laws work. It blocks out everything. If someone takes out a daycare license in your neighborhood, then it becomes illegal for you to live there in your house, or if a school opens. Plus, almost all available housing is blocked. These are maps of banishment laws in Chicago. So the red is, the green is where available housing is, and then the red on top of it is what's banished. So there's not much left underneath, and that isn't necessarily affordable housing that's in the green area. And then this is Brooklyn, which is almost completely blocked out. If you're against mass incarceration because you hold the view that it resembles the new Jim Crow segregation laws, you should not be indifferent to these state codes that demarcate where people can live and work or even walk for their entire lives and prosecute them for entering these zones, because that's just like the old Jim Crow. These are members of the Chicago 400. The Chicago 400 are people on registries who are experiencing homelessness, who therefore have to re-register, weekly at Chicago Police Headquarters. At the police station, they're lined up and given numbers, which are these blue cards that determine your place in line. And many people have to camp out in cars or spend the night at the police station to try to be first to register so they can go to work, take their kids to school, etc. And once they get the card, they wait in this bullpen, which is a term that naturalizes the detention of animals, so we shouldn't use that word. But it's a crowded room with benches and no bathroom and no plug. And they end up waiting all day there just to turn in these sheets of paper that say where you were homeless this week. You basically can't be homeless in the same place unless it's on trains or buses. It's a felony for missing even one day of registration or reporting the wrong address. Most Chicago 400 have already been sent back to prison for some hyper-technicality in this, such as staying indoors in a house in a banishment zone instead of being homeless. And you or me might do something like that too in order to live indoors. We might just go in our aunt's house and stay there one night instead of sleeping on the streets. So John lives on a golf course in blizzards. All of his stuff gets wet. He's been there 12 years. It's a person on our campaign. There's not many grassroots campaigns at all of people on registries, but the Chicago 400 are the first people experiencing homelessness on public conviction registries ever, organizing themselves to describe and change these laws. They produce hand-drawn diagrams and maps that depict the logistics of carrying out registration laws. These drawings help communicate their experiences to legislators and other system stakeholders for whom these laws and their impact are invisible. Clifford was writing out the laws one day. Let me catch up here. We need a place to stay. This is Leroy. Clifford was writing out the laws one day and he said, "We carry the law out." And that's what he and Sid wrote across the top of this 7-foot drawing, and it became a theme of our campaign. They carry out the law we made. And they just had their own show at the Drawing Center in New York. And that's a really tough place to exhibit at. Organizing is already hard, and people who are homeless are already in crisis. Many have 1 to 3 difficult jobs, or they're looking for work and are destitute. But they found time to launch a legislative campaign to say that they and their families are valuable, they are worthy people, and no one should believe the state labels. They're the Chicago 400, and we, the bystanders to these laws, are forming an alliance to support them with victim advocates, criminal justice and housing advocates, reentry specialists, treatment providers, prison watchdog groups, faith ministries, and artists. The campaign structure is shaped by the obstacles. Because people register the same day each week, we have leaders from Monday, Tuesday, etc., and they recruit in the bullpen. We who are not registering have to stay on the sidewalk. We can't go in the police station. The Chicago 400 folks come outside to talk, report updates, get flyers, and then they go in the bullpen and tell people what's happening. It's an inside-outside operation, just like prison organizing. And incidentally, the entire block around the police station is a banishment zone. So right there where we're standing, it is illegal, and they can get a felony for standing there. And the police come out and tell everyone to move. So for longer conversations, we go in McDonald's near the police station, and we also sometimes do programming in the McDonald's. So this is the McDonald's legal talk desk. After many meetings in many places, we are now trying to introduce legislation to end weekly registration and incrementally reduce housing banishment laws, which may not be possible, I just found out today. Here they are, some members of the Chicago 400 visiting a state rep. That's Zakia, Larry, JC, another Larry, and Mario, and James, and John. We are asking the state, we're also in the law, in the bill, asking the state to transfer the resources used for these damaging policies towards truly supporting crime survivors. Here's the Chicago 400 inside visiting the state rep, and here they are holding up their blue cards to show their presence at a hearing. This is the State House in Springfield, and some of the dads who come down the lobby there, like Robert right there, bring their kids. That's Chubby. These guys are great dads who want to live with their kids. This is Michael and Tayden, and Chastity is there. They can't live with their kids because their homes are in housing banishment zones. So those kids grow up without a father. Their fathers sleep in the car. They pay rent. They help pay for the house. They just can't live there. And this is, again, our lobbyist, Chubby, and his dad, and our bill sponsor, Representative McDermott, who's holding the bill we're trying to introduce. And she is impressively smart and fearless. And I'm trying to get a haircut like hers. But my hairdresser said I can't because I have such a cowlick, I can't part my hair on the side. So I can overcome that. For this campaign, we're all pitching in to embrace their stigma. Courtesy stigma is stigma that falls on those who associate with stigmatized persons. The Chicago 400 are turning the stigma around by changing the meaning of the blue cards. So they fill out these cards and say, if you can't see this, I am a father, a brother, an uncle, a family man. I volunteer in homeless shelters and soup kitchens. I try and spread happiness by always making a point of saying hi, good day, with a smile. I'm a son of God. I'm the son of Sophia and Benigno, the father of Alex. I'm a carpenter. I'm a member of the New Life Community Church. I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. I'm a member of Chicago 400. Almost everybody has made a card like this. Taking stigma in the chin is a critical political act. And what our campaign is saying is bring it on. Imagine if we had stood up for the people we called crack moms, super predators, welfare queens, rather than waiting 3 decades to do it. And here we're with the artists Mel Chin and Robin Bell who are visiting us. The Chicago 400 are asking for protection from the state. If you want to help, there's a lot you could do. Or if you don't want to help, you could still follow the Chicago 400 on Twitter. You can go through and heart all of the pictures of Robert and Chubby. We should learn about the people behind the labels before we sign on to their social death. That decision also marks us. We are all products of history, circumstance, free will, and other people's responses to us. Thank you.
So great, thank you. We're going to have dinner, and we'll do it table by table, and then we'll do Q&A after dinner.
Okay.
So we're gonna turn to the Q&A part of the evening. Excuse me. Yeah, we're gonna turn to the Q&A part. We've got half an hour for questions and answers. So thank you very much, Laurie. I'm gonna let you up here.
Is the mic working?
I think, is the mic working?
Yes, try it.
Is it working?
Yes.
There are a lot of great questions here, and the first 2 questions are related. One is, I wonder whether stigmatization and the labeling of other people can be eliminated or liquidated, as what's written, completely. It seems like if we delabel one group, society will find someone else to blame. Isn't it a natural thing? I guess the question really is, don't we always have to have someone to label? I mean, it reminds me of the Ursula Le Guin book, in which you end up with a society of everyone looking the same. You'll find something, their eye color or their eyelashes or something that will lead to discrimination. And then there's another question which is related: how can we convince the public that prisoners are people too? How do we get over this need to label people? And maybe start there.
Okay, well, those are really good questions. I am not a scholar of whether we can get rid of stigma. I don't know if we can get rid of stigma. But I do think that it's always in a historical context that we produce ideas of difference. And even just in the last 10 years, the ideas about who's different and different classification systems have changed. They're part of historical moments. They can't be separated. And I think we can improve those historical moments. And if you look at just the criminal justice system, just the recent history of the criminal justice system, from about the 1950s to, right before the 1970s, the prevailing ethic, the prevailing frame of the criminal justice system was that the villain, there's always a villain in kind of this narrative, the villain was poverty and deprivation. It was thought that poverty and deprivation produced crime. It wasn't located in the human body. It wasn't like, that's a sex offender, that's a murderer, that's a drug addict, that's a crack mom. It was... And so the ethic of the system at that time, in the 1950s and 1970s, even though it wasn't a perfect system by any means, but the ethic was rehabilitation and restoration. That was the goal of the prison system. And the public, there was like a firewall where the public didn't just say, you let that guy out of prison, off with your head. The public had trusted corrections professionals to decide when somebody got parole. It wasn't like this populist, it's called penal populism, where, we get to decide all this stuff because I should be able to say, who gets this and that and the death penalty. So it was in the tough on crime period that the system changed to be where the new kind of narrative was nothing works, and that's when we started labeling people in the criminal justice system. That's when all these labels, that's when we started to define crime as something inherent to a person. A person is destined to commit a crime. If they are a murderer, they're destined to be a murderer. So just in my short lifetime, I've seen that change, and then I also saw it change in about 2009, 2010. So actually in 2008, we had this slow buildup of the prison system. Some of you have seen the chart, the map of the prison system from 1975 to 2000, just going straight up of how many people are incarcerated. It was in 2008 that Pew did a count and said, oh my gosh, 1 in 100 people in the United States are in prison. We had just been, piling it on until the rates of people incarcerated were 1 in 100. And at that point, and for a lot of different reasons around 2010, 2012, we had another change in the basic overall narrative of the criminal justice system, which was that it's broken. There's something wrong with the system. There's too many people incarcerated. And that's why we've had a bipartisan agreement that there needs to be criminal justice reform. And that came about for a lot of reasons, but it's totally real. I mean, Trump just did, one of the first things to reform the criminal justice system. Of course, he can only control the federal government. It wasn't the best thing ever, but, he did more than people before him, more than Democrats before him did. So we're in a new era of thinking about criminal justice and thinking about this. We're not out of the old era, though. We still have these labels. So I guess the answer is yes. We don't have to depend on we don't have to stigmatize people in order to understand why crimes are committed and in order to run a system of public safety. It's not something we have to do. We're producing these meanings all the time, and we can all participate in not producing them. The second part of the question was, how do you convince the public? And I kind of wrapped that into the answer, sort of. Things are better than they were. I mean, when, I had a part of this talk that I took out that talked about the 90s. It's hard to even go back to this time, but I remember in the 90s, I was in grad school, and I had a anti-death penalty t-shirt. It's not like I was I was a big anti-death penalty person, but I didn't do anything. But I had a t-shirt, and I wore that into my grad school on a Sunday. And I just thought to myself, I just had a feeling if someone saw me, they'd feel disgust at seeing that I had an anti-death penalty t-shirt on. And it's when you break these out of these categories, when they're popular, it produces disgust. And that's how people feel about standing up for people in registries. It produces disgust, But how do you convince the public? You actually meet the people who are subject to these laws and listen to their stories. I mean, that is how you change the public. So one of our goals is, and I wish that I had a member of the Chicago 400 here, To the drawing center, we brought 6 people who were experiencing homelessness on registries, and they spoke and they just blew people away. When people meet the actual people that are subject to these laws, it transforms you. You can't believe the law you supported is doing this to these people. And we've seen, as you know, prisons are totally closed spaces, not available to the public. But as we see more and more people go in prisons through education programs and other things, people are coming out completely transformed about what the hell we're doing. And, people are just, they go in interested and come out abolitionists because it's really hard to see value to that system. Sorry for those long answers.
Can you just say a little bit about what the prison reform bill that the president signed has done, and how has it played in your community?
Well,
I mean, has it had an impact in the prison? Has it actually made a difference? And B, I know the president is using it as a way to try and argue that he should get votes for people in that world. I'm wondering if it's had an effect.
Well, most prisoners are not federal prisoners, so no matter what the president does, it does not have a very big impact. Most of our laws, both public conviction registry laws and our prisons and our state laws. Our prisons are state prisons. There's only a few federal prisons. So what he did and what Obama did before him, which was marginal, only affected federal prisoners. So it hasn't affected anybody in my state because we don't have a federal prison. I do know some people who work on this federal stuff, and there's been people with long drug sentences who have gotten out. I mean, I'm not, there was a big fight in the advocate community about whether this bill was doing too little to support or whether it was doing enough that people should support it, Trump's bill. So I'm not like saying it's the most amazing thing ever, but it's something. I mean, it did help people, it's helping people with long sentences get out sooner if they have drug crimes. And I don't know it that well. I actually learned it so that I could teach it to my decarceration class, but then I don't really remember exactly everything in it. But it's not that big a deal, but I mean, hey, he gets credit for doing it.
There's a question, expand on why art is your method of choice for reforming the criminal justice system, how art works in your work.
Well, there's a lot of ways to answer that question because there's different types of art in different ways that some I didn't even have a chance to talk about, in both of these campaigns that I described, these 2 campaigns. But I think the larger issue for me is that if you look at these systems, the prison system, public registry, the criminal justice system, we have people in place who are paid to reform those systems. And those are big nonprofits or small nonprofits. They're like the ACLU or the Shriver Center on Poverty Law or homeless advocates or, the John Howard Center, the John Howard Association of Illinois, or just you name it. There's a bunch of criminal justice advocates. And there's a bunch of people working on homelessness, and there's a bunch of people working on social issues. It's hard for those people to take on the issue of public conviction registries. Can anyone guess why that would be hard for those people to take on this issue?
Someone can try.
Yes,
Because
Charlotte.
It can keep them from getting reelected.
Correct. It can keep, if they're legislators, it can keep them from being reelected. But if they're the organization, they would have to ask a legislator to work on that, and the legislator might not be reelected. But and also if it's the same general theme. It's not a popular issue. It's an unpopular issue. Very, very, very unpopular. It has stigma. You get courtesy stigma for working on it. So no organization really wants courtesy stigma because it affects their membership and their fundraising and their members and everybody, and So as an artist, I don't have that issue. I do not have membership. I don't have funding like that. I don't have people to report to. And so in a sense, I feel like for me, working as an artist and having a job as an artist, I'm able to be in the world but not of it. I can actually focus on the fact that these policies are terrible and unacceptable, and I can afford to be somebody who works on it and works on a campaign to change them. So to me, the art is the I mean, the overarching way that I see it as art is it's that insight that's available because of the freedom that you have as an artist if you choose to take it, that you don't have necessarily if you're a legislator or if you're a nonprofit that has to reproduce itself every year.
Questions or comments? There's more here. I'll just give you guys a chance to continue anything that's been said if you have an idea. Yeah.
Yeah, just building on that conversation our table was having was about the attention you drew to language that we use possibly without even thinking about it, which ends up reinforcing these stereotypes. Can you just talk maybe a little bit about how, as individuals, even if we're not engaged in this kind of activism, what we can do socially in terms of language and art and so on, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, I think everyone should and can always refrain from using these labels, because when you say the word super predator to describe somebody in Washington, D.C. in the 1990s who got a murder charge, you are making an ideological statement that that person is about why that person committed a crime and why they're in that life circumstance. You are saying that they are just inherently this horrible person and always will be. And that's true if you say any of the terms that the criminal justice system comes up with. And an example, I could go back and show you this, or I can just tell you, but some of the guys in the TAMS pictures are wearing different colored jumpsuits. And that's because the prison system constantly labels them and gives them different jumpsuit colors. So staff assaulters is a label they have now. And when you go in prisons, you go cell front, they have posted staff assaulter, escape risk, level E. I mean, they give people all these classifications, and then they act like there's some scientific, description of people. It's really well known that prisons that have high numbers of staff assaults have high numbers of staff assaults because there's high numbers of staff assaulting people. So these labels are bizarrely almost an inverse of what they are. So one of our our job in working on the TAMS campaign, I know it's hard to go back in time and think about this, but a legislator or somebody would just say, well, those are the worst of the worst. And that just erases everything you're saying, because they're like, oh, if she's talking about the worst of the worst, oh, forget it, then they have to be in isolation. It really, they provide an explanation for the whole system. Just this label provides an explanation for the whole system. And the same is true with what we call in our campaign the SO word. And we say we do not use the term, you know what I mean when I say SO. We don't use that term. We say a person with a past conviction, because all of these folks are people with past convictions. They're just like anybody else with past convictions. And they should have the chance to move on with their lives. Some of these folks had their convictions in the 80s, 90s, 2000. I mean, you're on registries for life. And registries are completely after punishment. They have nothing to do with punishment. They're just like, you're just going to be connected to the police department the rest of your life. So don't say that word. Don't say that word. Say a person with a past conviction. Don't use those words. Don't give the state, don't do the state's work for the state.
So this actually leads into the next question, which uses the SO word, so I'm going to have to figure out how to use it. But how would you think to explain the issue with having an SO, a sex offender, resisting, how would you explain, I guess, to the public the issue of not having a registry? And how do you actually talk to the public and to the neighborhoods and explain to them that they shouldn't worry about having a person with a past conviction for a kind of sexual crime living in their neighborhood? How do you make that case, I guess the question is, and I think it's an important question.
So just a clarification, the registry itself just lists people on the internet, so it just makes it totally impossible for them to ever not have the stigma and ever get a job. Their kids' names, their addresses listed on the internet, not their kids' names, but if they share the same last name with their families, their family's addresses on the internet. So That's separate. I think what you're asking about is the housing banishment laws. So the housing banishment laws say that you can live next door to somebody, you just can't live within 500 feet or whatever it is. For some states it's 2,000, 1,000, some states don't have housing banishment laws. So I think the question you're asking is, what if people say, I want to know where people are living, right? Because they can live.
I guess they want to not be near,
Yeah.
they want to be able to have not in their community, I guess is what I think you hear a lot, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I go back to some of the things I said here. I didn't have a chance to go into them in as much detail as I might with somebody, but the vast majority of sexual offenses, of sexual offending, of sexual misconduct happens without ever being reported, and it happens in people's own homes, in their own families, with their coaches, with their teachers, with their priests, with their uncles, with their fathers, with their brothers, with their mothers, with their siblings. The vast majority of child sexual abuse is done within families, et cetera, and is also the majority is by other youth, by other kids doing child sexual abuse. So if you really care about prevention, if that is really your concern, public safety, we have the means to teach our kids, teach in schools, and we're working on it now, thanks to Me Too, but primary prevention is within our grasp. We have to have bystander education. We have to teach our kids and how to act with other people and what to be afraid of and what to say no to and what is expected and what isn't. We have to have much stronger tools for having kids feel comfortable reporting and talking to their parents. All of this stuff is how you prevent sexual abuse and violence. The way you don't prevent it is by pretending that it's always somebody else that is living on a registry, that's some horrible person somewhere. That is exactly, it was a feminist insight in the 60s and 70s where sexual abuse and violence came from and why. And we basically just pushed pause on that for 20 years and just focused on strangers. So if people are interested in safety, they need to really invest in public safety. And by having people not report, because it really becomes really hard to report when you're going to put your father on the registry for life or your boyfriend, etc. It's somebody in your family. And, not to idealize the 70s and 80s and 60s, but at that time, if you did report sexual abuse or violence in your family, you had the ability to say, I want this person to be restored, to be healed. I want to still be in the family with my father. And that person, or whoever, the uncle, the mother, that person would have the opportunity to get wraparound counseling and separation from the family and then reunification. And so would the person who was harmed. But that is just not possible anymore. I mean, people have to push somebody off a cliff to report. So, I could go on and on about that, but if you really care about sexual violence, that's not what we should be doing. About where people are living, crimes don't occur based on where people live. So the most discredited of all these laws are the housing banishment laws. And in fact, there was a study in Minnesota, also one in California, where they actually studied, it wasn't just an extrapolation of where crime happens, they actually looked at every single crime before and after housing banishment laws, and found that only 2 crimes took place within a housing banishment zone anyway. They just happened to be closer to a school or whatever it was. But the crime happened because the person was in the family already. They already had access to the home. The other thing is about this, if you look at Chubby and Robert, Robert works from 2 a.m. to 10 a.m. Then he goes to register and sleeps in the car and waits until about 4 o'clock. Then he goes home where his kids have already been picked up from school, but his wife's at work, and takes care of the kids, feeds the dog, cooks for the kids, does homework with them. He has another kid besides Chubby, a girl who's 6, who's also adorable. And then he gets them to bed by 8:30 because he can't leave the house at night because they cry and scream about their daddy leaving. And the mom comes home at midnight, and so after he puts them to bed at 8:30, he washes himself up, sees the mom at midnight, and then leaves to go sleep in a car. So how is that making anybody safer? when people hear these stories, there's no universe that you're safer because this man is sleeping in a car outside instead of in his home with his kids, you know? So it really just takes people unpacking it about 6 minutes, and they're pretty much like, oh, that's really stupid. I don't know.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
If most sexual crime happens within the family or the home, I'm just wondering if you have the numbers for that and what kind of educational work can be done in that respect.
I mean, if you look at RAIN or any or Stop It Now or any organization dedicated to ending sexual abuse and violence, they have these statistics, and it's based on, I mean, it's divided by how old the victim is. So for young victims, it's hugely takes place in the home. The older the victim is, the more, you know, it's slightly more possibility of a stranger offense, but it's still, the majority is not a stranger offense. So I can get that for you. I mean, it's really, there's a really available statistics. But, you know, since we're on the topic, even like, I mean, the most horrible, like you know, type of sexual assault. I mean, I've learned this through, I'm a member of ATSA, which is the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. So I have learned a lot from researchers and treatment providers. It's basically the professional organization for treatment providers. And it's from seeing some of these presentations about there's so many different pathways to sexual abuse and violence, and even to rape. I mean, I think having grown up as a feminist, you know, didn't consider that there was any like possibility that somebody could be redeemable and commit a rape, you know. I mean, it just wasn't like part of the worldview that was available to me. But there's a lot of different pathways to sexual violence and even rape. And so I've seen a lot of presentations on this now, and I've just, you know, I've come to learn about it much more. But, you know, when people have adverse childhood experiences, they become desensitized to violence. And that is something that happens among gang bangers, you know, I mean, I live in Chicago where we have a lot of gun violence. And it's really some of the same systems and mechanisms are happening. We tend to think, that's the thing, we think sexual offending is specialists. But it's not specialists. It's people who, you know, through a series of different pathways have come to commit sexual violence and misconduct. It is not the end of someone's life or decency as a person that their pathway leads them to sexual violence or sexual abuse. Now, obviously, it's extremely harmful, terrible thing if somebody commits sexual violence. It's very damaging. And we must, you know, they have to be held accountable for that. But the strange thing is, after somebody is held accountable, if somebody has not committed a new offense, so not to get too wonky about this, but there's been all these really interesting regression studies done by Carl Hansen. If you want to look them up or if you want to email me, I'll send them to you. But he actually invented these risk assessment tests, which are a little bit controversial for various reasons, but because they're racist, etc. But if no matter how serious what someone did, how serious it is, if they do not reoffend within 10 years, they reach something called the redemption point. And the redemption point is where their probability of committing a new sex offense is unremarkable. It's about the same as anyone in the general population. It's the same as anyone with any criminal history at all, which is really similar to people with an elevated risk to sexually offend, which are college-age men. So somebody who has reached the redemption point after 10 years, and that's if they have a very serious offense originally, their risk to offend is not only unremarkable, it's similar to that of a college-age male committing a brand new spontaneous offense, because college-age males are at a slightly elevated risk to commit a spontaneous sex offense. So we kind of act like it's this permanent feature, but if you actually look at the actuarial data, it isn't at all. People have really low recidivism rates after they've been convicted, and that's why arrested, and that's why it's so important that people report, and that, you know, we don't just like we don't have that. It's so important we don't have the system we have now where nobody reports. I promise to answer these questions faster if there's more.
Which communities are hardest to attract? I mean, you know, you tell the story about Chubby and his father. I forget his father's name is?
Robert.
Robert. And it's hard to imagine that not being a convincing story. So I guess there's two parts to this question as I'm seeing it. One is, who's not buying it? Who's not buying that story, that this makes no sense? And then two is, it seems that part of the issue goes back to the last question about, is there a disconnect between stranger violence and in-home violence, and should these be seen as the same issue, or should you actually separate these issues? But maybe those are, I'm just seeing those as related questions, because it seems hard to believe that someone seeing Robert and Chubby's story doesn't get convinced in some way.
People who meet Chubby, who is like seriously the cutest child, like really seriously cute child, and Robert, who is adorable and a great dad also. Together they're adorable, separately they're adorable, whatever. Yes, people are convinced. I really try to take Chubby to Springfield when I can. And Tayden and Michael are the same way, all of them. I mean, all of these guys are fathers too, they just have, they have older kids, so they can't bring them to Springfield. They are convinced. I mean, I'm amazed I've been lobbying in Springfield. Our bill sponsor is a Republican. We've talked to prosecutors. We've talked to, everybody, every different type of person. This is the thing. The public is the last to know how damaging and pointless these laws are. All of the legislators are like, I know. I mean, it's a joke to legislators that they pass all these laws. They joke about it. They joke because they're using those laws to have a direct mail flyer for their next campaign. And the Speaker of the House in Illinois and every state house hands legislators bills to say pass a sex offender law. Because if they have that bill, they can pass that bill because nobody can say no to it. They have to pass it. And then they'll have a bill in their name, and they'll have a direct mailer in their name that says, I was tough on sexual predators, blah, blah, blah. I can tell you, my representative just did a flyer that sounds like he's talking about our bill. It's so crazy. Whatever. But so in the state house, though, they know. I mean, the question is, can I vote for it? The question isn't how bad these laws are. The question is, do I have the courage to vote for it? And the answer is no. They don't always have the courage to vote for it. In fact, they never do. But we're trying, that's why you have to do the political work. Like, we're trying to do media on this. I mean, these folks are the first people to really just come out and say, this is wrong, and we are good people, and we should be able to move on with our lives. I can't believe I can't believe how much they take care of their families, how much they take care of each other, how much they do, how many jobs they have. I cannot believe how well they do considering everything, But when people meet them, they are convinced, and the legislators are convinced. They're just not willing to vote for it. There was another part to that question. Sorry, what was that? The difference between,
do you separate them?
The reason I don't separate them, I do separate them. That's a problem it's just, the idea of talking about all violence with one swoop, like child sexual abuse. There's just a million different kinds of sexual misconduct, and we are talking about it like it's all happens for the same reason, or happens in the same way, or there's the same pathways. But that said, people who commit sexual assault, or the worst, type of sexual assault you can think of, are totally, there's still some of the same pathways that lead to violence that lead to that. And having substance abuse, there's all kinds of pathways. And like I said, if somebody has not committed a new offense, we have one guy actually, if someone has not committed a new offense in 10 years, and their probability of committing new offense is unremarkable, in that sense, I don't treat people differently. That nobody should be subject to these laws after they've been punished. They've been severely punished, and after that, they should not be subject to these laws. If these laws had any public safety value, they are actually laws that are criminogenic. If you just damage people, you make people worse. That's what prisons do. If these laws had any public safety value whatsoever, it might be worth a conversation about who should be subject to them. But that's not true. They don't have that. They do not have any public safety value.
Questions?
You can go back to Tam's if you want.
I was actually going to, there's a question about solitary. One of the questions is, what is solitary like in New York? I don't necessarily know about. There's another interesting one. As people are preparing to potentially be in quarantine and solitary for a long time, is that in some way an opportunity to think about solitary confinement, and how would you use that or do that?
Yeah, that's a really good idea. If you're in quarantine, to think about that. One of the, different people in solitary confinement have, it's come from a couple of different places, but they say if you want to know what it's like to be in solitary, lock yourself in your bathroom for a year. Working on the TAMS campaign those years, I did have to stay in my apartment and work like all day, every day for days on end. And I did really think about that a lot. I mean, obviously I was doing it voluntarily and there's no comparison, and didn't have guards being cruel to me. But I do think, the idea behind solitary is that you're missing a set of reference points of seeing other people, talking to other people, having sensory experiences like wind and cold and flowers and dogs and cats and whatever, And so I do think it's an opportunity to think about that. Whatever you can do to start thinking and having other people think about that, I think that's really helpful. In New York has really, really awful solitary confinement, and there's a group in New York called CAIC, C-A-I-C, which is the Coalition for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement. And it's called isolated confinement because in New York, and this is true in Illinois too, and other states, people are confined in very small cells, but with a cellmate. There's also a lot of solitary in New York, but they're including in the definition of solitary, isolated confinement with another person, because people actually develop this, you are so close to people, you have to put up a mental block to, they're using the bathroom right there, they're sleeping right there, you're so close to people, it's really, and without any room to leave ever, it's really, it creates this really damaging psychological situation where people almost like isolate themselves psychologically in a cell with each other. But anyway, CAIC has been trying to pass a bill called the HALT Solitary Bill in New York for the last 3 years, if not 4 years. And they actually got everyone, if I'm correct, which I think I am, but you can look it up, they actually got enough bill sponsors to pass the bill. It's just that the governor would never pass it. The governor would never sign it. So they're trying again this year. So if you're interested, look up CAIC, C-A-I-C, and we did a lot of photo requests from solitary stuff with folks in New York to help support them, because it's very close. It's very frustrating. And it would limit solitary confinement in New York State prisons.
We're sort of out of time, but is there a final question that anyone has? Burning question? Yes.
Can you speak to any community-based solutions that you've seen as alternatives to incarceration for addressing this kind of issue?
This issue being people with sex offenses?
Yeah.
People with sex offenses aren't necessary. People all need the same things. People in prison need the same things. What are the causes of crime? What are the causes of violence? What are the causes of harming another person? Whatever the answer is, you're not getting it in prison. And it's, there's a menu of things: exposure to childhood violence, desensitization, substance abuse problems, one thing nobody's mentioned is the huge racial disparities on sex offense registries and other registries. That should help. I gave you the numbers: 1 in 48. Actually, now I can't remember the numbers. I know 1 in 84 African American men in Illinois is on the sex offense registry. Something like 1 in 48 is on a public conviction registry. Those are incredibly high rates. So people need their needs met. They need to have their needs met. That is when people have a positive outlook on life and they have their needs met, they are unlikely to have a path to crime and harming other people. When they do, they need to be held accountable for that. They need to be, so there's restorative justice processes where you're faced with what you did. The thing that happens in prison and in our current criminal justice system is that throughout the system, if you're a rational person going through the system, you deny what you did. You deny that you harmed somebody. you deny, because if you give anything, you're just going to get a worse sentence. And so our system is set up so that people never acknowledge harm. Then when people are in prison, there's hardly anything where people are never asked why they did what they did, or, I mean, there's nothing in place. So a restorative justice process is the opposite, where you actually face what you did and the harm that it did to someone else rather than deny it. And I'm not saying people are like in denial. I mean, people are totally accountable for what they did, but they can't be throughout the process because they're already getting severely punished. So they're not going to just add to it by like adding on, the harm they did. I mean, they're just getting like 20 years. I mean, their whole life is in prison. But the other thing I should mention is other countries don't have registries. We never used to have registries. But there's a really interesting story, which I'll wrap up with, that in Canada, there was one guy leaving prison. I'm trying to remember where in Canada this was. Sorry, I don't know Canada well enough to explain where it was. But he was leaving prison, and the prison, he had something called an expiration of sentence, which basically means he maxed out. Nobody could do anything for, to bring him back. It was like he had to go because his sentence was over. But people thought that he had a very high risk of reoffending and actually offending against a child because he had sexually abused children. And so the prison officer, or the probation officer who said like he's getting out, called the Mennonite church, because he was a Mennonite, and he called the Mennonite church and said, look, you all have to do something with this guy. He's getting out, and I'm afraid he's going to hurt somebody. In fact, he has a 100% chance of hurting somebody. So the Mennonite church created this thing called circles of support and accountability, where instead of shunning him and stigmatizing him and making him homeless and making him jobless and giving him no positive outlook for the future, they befriended him. And so circles of support and accountability are where you walk with people through life and hold them accountable, but you also support them. And that guy, that was such a successful thing. That guy never reoffended, and then they started doing more and more, and they never, ever reoffended. I mean, one thing that happens in our system is we degrade people and damage people so much with every crime, and then we're just surprised that people commit crimes. I mean, that's how, if I wanted to get y'all to commit crimes, I would make you homeless and jobless and give you no outlook for your future and stigmatize you. So this system, Canada ended up adopting that system throughout all of Canada, and it's called COSA, support, and so it became part of the prison system. And that's where when people get out, they are supported in leading their life. Now, I'm not saying Canada is like perfect and everybody loves people on registries or whatever, but they have the system to help people, and it really works. And other countries have adopted it. And there's actually a couple of Department of Corrections in the US that have also adopted it. So, I mean, it's just common sense. Like, what we're doing is the opposite of common sense. It's just so deranged, really. I mean, to do this to people. What we should do is help people. That's how you prevent harm and violence.
Well, on that hopeful note, please join me in thanking Laurie.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
There's still some dessert up here, if anyone wants some dessert or food.
I am going back tomorrow. Yeah, I know. Yeah, right. I know. Hopefully I'll just have a flight and quarantine myself. I actually have this secret that our bill is being it's that, that snow day mentality. Really? How old is he? Wow, good for him. It's because of the